My name is Salman Hameed. I'm an astronomer, and I'm a professor at Hampshire College in Massachusetts. And I'm also I run Kainaat Studios, which produces videos about science for South Asia and some in the U.S. as well. Nissa, if you
Hi,
would.
I'm Nisse. I am a science communicator of over a decade of doing science communication, mostly on stage, and a performer and a writer. Uh, and I'm happy to be here. And Jenni, we were just wondering how you wanted to introduce yourself. Where are you thinking? How are you thinking of yourself nowadays?
Um, I was about to say old, but
That's a
I've
great
been
that's the core of the definition sometimes.
I've been a science communicator for more than 35 years. Excuse me. Working in particularly the environmental science area, uh, but yeah, and working all over the globe really. And I feel very privileged to have been in this space and to have done a range of things. I think, Nisse, I've actually always wanted to be a performer, but I haven't ever
Mm.
quite been discovered. But
This is your
but
night. You're here.
but in my role as a science communicator, I certainly get to perform from time to time.
Well, that's
That's
that's great. And for people who are wondering, Jenny is she's in Australia, and we are dealing with two different time frames. And you're the director of Econnect Communication, which is a science communication consultancy. How do you define that?
Sorry, I have a little bit of asthma. I'm not sure why it's playing up all of a sudden. Um, yes, I'm the director of Econnect Communication, and we're Australia's first science communication consultancy. We've been going for over 28 years. Now there are many people who are science communication consultants. Possibly the first in the world. I don't know. I don't know for sure, but certainly in Australia. And we do a range of things, but we particularly specialize in trying to make a difference to people's lives through positive engagement with science and through participation and dialogue with science. We don't do publicity for science, we do engagement with science.
No. Okay.
I was really struck. I mean, even as you're talking right now, talking about the longevity of your time in this space of science communication and the paper I don't know when you wrote it actually, but that was reflecting on your 20 years. I was really struck by how like you were reflecting on your transformations of your mindsets. Um, where do you see yourself at right now? Like, what are you seeing as like your perspective right now? And what do you feel like you wish if somebody read that paper? What do you feel like is the thing you want people to come away with as your perspective nowadays?
I think where I am now is actually embracing, and I think I said that in that paper, which was for JCOM. I think I see myself now as embracing the whole messiness and chaos of
Mm.
science communication. And I don't feel like I have to be in control and ordering it and be in that position of more privileged power in many ways in the process. And that can be a scary space, but it can be quite exhilarating as well. So it's about allowing other people to have their voice and to recognize their knowledge and to recognize their experiences as being um, valid in a space that has been dominated very much by Western science ethos.
Can you say a little bit? You said sort of like the messiness, and if you can just bring us into the messiness about what messiness are we talking about?
We're talking about the fact that communication isn't as it. I mean, I don't think it's ever really been one way, but has quite often been, particularly in the 1800s, 1900s. It was about scientists explaining to an ignorant public about their discoveries and their learnings, which was great, and people were fascinated with that. But it meant that their knowledge was separate in many ways to other people's knowledge. And then there was this call for a dialogue, and we had people talking in two-way. Well, just on Monday, I was in a meeting looking at First Nations and their perception of environmental water for the environment, and it was and our group, which included mostly First Nation people in Australia, agreed that communication engagement about the science of environmental water flows, was in many directions, and it included cultural knowledge about water, cultural values about water, and so on. And so this is like communication going in many directions, and it can seem chaotic. But I think Alan Irwin, when he was talking about third order thinking in the science communication space, he talked about embracing the chaos. And I think that's reading his work was when I first started to think about this and see that in this what appears to be a mess can be a lot of strength and a lot of ways of as a society moving forward on things that are really important and that really matter.
Could you define that third order thinking a little more? Could you tell me about that? I haven't heard that before.
I think Alan Irwin in about 2008 actually wrote about the three orders of thinking in the whole science communication engagement space. And to some extent, they mimic the three main science communication models, but they are different. So first order thinking is about that one-way communication, which is often referred to badly, I think, in the literature as a deficit model, because I think there is always a place for scientists to communicate, usually in one direction, their new knowledge, their new discoveries. There's always a place for that, and it's important, and people want to know those things.
This is the dissemination model,
Yeah,
sort of.
yeah. And dissemination is a word I much rather prefer because
I love that.
We need new knowledge, we need new understanding, whether it comes from scientists or other people. And the second order is more that dialogue one of interaction. But Irwin's third order is about that lots of different communication happening in all different directions. And in his lens, it was particularly within the policy science interface, which is something I find really interesting as well. That whole understanding all the different players and actors in formulating policy, where science is just one of the players.
Yeah. So I mean, piggyback on that. So I mean, that I think makes, I mean, in some sense, makes a lot of sense. Because because that's how science also happens, because science also unlike sort of this model that, oh, this is happening sort of in isolation, it happens in society, and of course society is impacted and vice versa, right? I mean, so both of those things are happening. So but you mentioned something, and Nisse and I were actually having a conversation about it just yesterday, in order to prepare to talk to you as well. You mentioned sort of about Western science, that is the, I mean, in some sense, when we are talking about these things, we need to come out of that, or we need to broaden our approach. How does that work? And again, so then it goes into this thing, okay, how do we define Western science, right? And we get into those murky, messy aspects to that. So how do you define that? And when you say, okay, so we need to move beyond that, how does that feature? What does it? How do we envision that?
There's no simple answer to that, but yeah, I guess I mean I've been working in a lot of different cultures over the last 30 years, in particular from Papua New Guinea, and women working in agriculture there, and agricultural science and agriculture practices, to more sophisticated, if you like, ways of dealing with issues in Western countries like Australia, New Zealand, and so on. But I mean, the thing that has impressed me over that time is that the Western scientific knowledge, which is very much based on the whole objective scientific method and so on, definitely has a role, but and it's an important role, and it's a role that should continue. But recognizing other forms of knowledge, other epistemologies, if you like, is something that's important, but it can be something that's very, very hard for Western scientists to accept and to grapple with. I remember talking to astronomers in South Africa who certainly didn't want to accept anything that wasn't in that Western science objective, the whole scientific method type framework that they could understand. And so they would dismiss and not even listen to other forms of knowledge and understanding, which may have evolved, which not may, has evolved over many, many millennia in different cultures.
I think yeah, I think what I'm really curious about this interaction of having a pluriversal understanding of what types of science we can include, instead of seeing it as this binary of like a Western science and an indigenous science. But you said in one of your papers, I want to make sure I get it right. You said we need to move beyond the term science and the concept of science as it is currently understood. And you were talking at that time, if I remember right, that about sort of the methodology of publishing, the incentives of like where science is done. And so I was like, I don't know, I was excited. I'm all about like moving outside of the ivory tower to put science into many different spaces. I'm a part of a community college permaculture club, and that's like 90% of the science I do right now is gardening. But like where I also have
which is critical, and there are so many people out there with knowledge that is critical to how we garden for a more food secure future.
Yeah.
So absolutely.
But I guess like when you think of a new paradigm of science, when you try to imagine that truly, and I think this is what I struggle with any pluriversal politic idea, is like, I don't know. Theoretically, I love it. Practically, I get a little overwhelmed. Here's an example. I want to use this example. Salman, we were talking about this just before, that 20 years ago in your field, Salman, you had sort of a model with a variable that you just sort of ignored. You pretended it was 0. And then they were like, actually, it's not 0. I might be butchering these.
No. I can give you a specific example.
Yeah,
we were talking about dark energy,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, 25 years ago, when I was in grad school, there was no dark energy. So, in the equations, we would ignore it, and that made life much easier. I took cosmology, and I did well because we didn't have to deal with that. And the year after, they were like, oh, now we have evidence for that. You cannot ignore it, and it made it complicated. But we did not know what dark energy was. So, Nisse, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, so then when you were telling me is that then there was this new model, but then there was a new model. And then after 25 years, there's like so many models of how to describe that. And that sort of, I started thinking about your paper of that there's these 3 models: dissemination, dialogue, participatory models of, and your argument at the end was like, we need more. And I was like, yes, we do. Theoretically, I'm all for that. Practically, what does that look like, Jenni? What does it look like to have so many models? Because as Salman was saying, he was like, now there's just so many models. Well, you say for you.
If I can jump in that sense, like, but our problem is that we think as astronomers that one of the models is right. Whereas I think with Jenni would say, like, all of them go in, and that's the messiness. Sorry, but Jenni, am I in the right ballpark? Like, so the more models maybe it may work.
Yeah, no, I mean, at the last Public Communication Science and Technology conference in Rotterdam last May, last year, it seems like ages ago, but it was only last May, that we had a workshop on models, and people got down on the floor with bits of paper and started to draw things, and other people, they got their lanyards and they started to form some physical model with their lanyards, their conference lanyards. And it was really quite exciting. And a model, you've got to think about, well, what is the purpose of a model? And I'm sure some of you do this all the time. But the purpose of a model, in my view, is to be some representation of reality that helps to explain what we see through evidence, and then helps us to predict what might happen in the future. So, so there will be different models for different circumstances. But in terms of science communication, I just think we can't not have just one model. It's a churn of models, and it's about fundamentally, and the model that I came up with at the end of my PhD, which is the Nexus Model, was very much about the fact that all good and effective, I would say, effective, whatever that word means, effective communication is based on relationships. And that's, in a word, the messiness of science communication. But on Monday, when we were talking about what's needed in this new program, looking at monitoring and evaluation of environmental water and First Nations involvement in that, in the science and management of environmental water, the word relationships came up all the time. And one of the Aboriginal elders there said, "We are relationship people. We are not data people." And I think that was really interesting. But essentially, we're all relationship people.
Yeah, of course.
And it doesn't matter if we're Indigenous, First Nation people or not. We're all relationship people. And data is a tool within those relationships. It doesn't become the whole of everything. And I think in many ways that's the issue with Western science, is that they see data as being the whole of everything rather than a useful tool.
Yeah, so that's actually, I love it. I would, especially relationship, like, that aspect. So if I can ask a question in this direction, and that is about, but there are particular, although you mentioned astronomy, the South African astronomer as well, so I shouldn't exclude astronomy from there. But I'm just wondering, in a science communication landscape where, and we will be putting this conversation on YouTube as well, right? So I mean, I mean, and you can imagine, well, so people have relationship with their audience, right, to a certain degree, but it's tricky, right? I mean, so because I mean, I don't know if the First Nation would think that as an engagement or as a relationship, the kind of engagement that you get online, which is a particular type. And with, so like, okay, so if you are Neil deGrasse Tyson, you have 1 million followers who are commenting, and like, and you engage with a few, or like, or you pronounce your engagement, right? I mean, you are picking and choosing what you want to extract out and call it engagement, for example, right? So what do you do on the issue of scale? I mean, and maybe the answer might be, well, really, I mean, there is an inherent problem in those scale models. Like, that really doesn't. It's not worth it, or it's something different. But so, how would you
That's
think about
interesting.
issues of sort of like large scale conversations happening, and whether you would call that engagement or
No, it's a really good point, and it's a point that I struggle with because a lot of participatory communication, a lot of another word that came up on Monday was co-design, co-delivery, co-delivery, co-reporting. A lot of that, it relies on a small group of people. And then you get into questions of representation. Do those people, are they really representation of larger groups of people? However, I think the way in which I've come to some understanding of the mass versus the non-mass audience is that relationships are based on trust, and there is interpersonal trust, which is the sort of area that I'm mostly working at, because I don't tend to deal with mass communication so much anymore. But then there's institutional trust, and the relationship that you have with, say, research organizations, with government institutions, with NGOs. And that's where the whole issue of context becomes important. And so I was involved in writing a paper last year with the International Science Institute. And part of that paper, the paper was focused on the whole fact that one of the issues at the interface between policy and science, and the socialization of science with policy, is a failure to understand context. And that includes the context in which research organizations are seen, the context and the relationships between research organizations and policy institutions, and so on. But also, of course, an understanding of the values and perceptions of people. And so that whole idea of context, I think, is one way of understanding different relationships that go beyond the small group to the bigger group. I think online is a whole different area of engagement. And I think my personal view, I've done a little bit of research in this, but not a huge amount, not as much as many other people. And that is that in many ways online, and I know that some people disagree with this, but to me, there's a series of little communities that are set up where people sort of join with other people who have similar values to them. And they become, as called in literature, echo chambers in many respects. So it's that talking to the already converted. I also wonder about how much real engagement happens beyond one way in the online space, but particularly in a mass sense with instruments like YouTubes and blogs and so on. But it's certainly a tool that, again, is useful engagement. I'm not saying it's not, and it's becoming increasingly important. I was reminded again on Monday, because this was a face-to-face meeting, was that all the people in that meeting I had only met online over the last couple of years. And the quality of conversation was so much better face-to-face. So although I think online conversations like this are really important and can be really effective.
You hate this. You don't want to be here anymore.
I just think, and we've been able to achieve a hell of a lot with this sort of platform, and so I'm a fan of it. But I still think for the best quality relationships, the best quality conversations are going to happen, as I say, belly button to belly button.
Relationally, like you're pointing out, it's relationships. I mean, you made me think about when you brought up trust. That makes me think of, I don't know, the Susan Fiske study about warmth and competence building trust, and how warmth oftentimes is this sort of made its rounds, I think, very in the spaces I taught in a lot. And what I noticed is once people knew this model of like warmth begats trust, uh, people started imitating warmth, and it was like so inauthentic to me as a performer. And this
It
is
doesn't work.
no, absolutely. And they're saying I'm doing warmth, I'm doing all the warmth statements, and it's like it's not going to work if you're a robot. And I think this gets into the context of like how do you actually prepare science communicators for the context of actually being with people, when so often science communicators are being trained in an echo chamber of science communication.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm a little bit of a rebel. In my spare time, I never watch science documentaries. I never go to hear science people speak. Um, I want to get away from science in my spare time, whereas a lot of my colleagues love all that stuff, and so they are in those echo chambers. But back to your question, I think the most important skill for a science communicator, um, absolutely and without question, is the skill of listening. And that skill is not taught as much as it should be. And if you think about it, even when you're writing a story about science, that requires you to listen to the voices on that story and to ask questions that will allow you to elicit the authentic, true messages. Right through to where you're trying to engage communities in understanding some scientific concept. It's about listening to where they're at and their context and their perceptions, and asking the right questions. So, and genuinely listening. To me, that's where relationships develop. It's not through inauthentic, warm statements. I was privileged to be involved in a long-running participatory program in Australia, involving farmers and scientists on climate risk. And I saw over the 6 years of that project, and it was a long, expensive project, but real relationships developed between the scientists and the farmers and between each other, which really affected all the communication that happened. The scientists felt they were safe enough to be critical of their own organisations. They felt safe enough to be open about their uncertainty with their climate predictions and models, and to explain what they didn't know as much as what they did know. The scientists learnt new knowledge and new ways of researching and communicating, and new research questions from interacting with the farmers. So it's
What do you think allowed for that safety? Like what do you think gave that sense of being able to do that?
at least twice a year we would get together face to face, usually on someone's farm, and with as much informal as formal interactions. So allowing for social interaction as well as more formal interactions. We also deliberatively got them to listen to each other. So scientists needed to listen to the farmers and vice versa, and allowing lots of time not just for presenting but for dialogue, with whole sessions just being on dialogue, not presenting. So that sort of process, and in between times, we acted, one of my team, more or less every day, was putting scientists and farmers in touch with each other about questions and issues and that they might have. So it was a constant, regular interaction.
Can I? So I mean, And I think that's I mean, especially climate change, because it's I mean, this is our defining issue of this time, um, and of course, especially in the US, but of course it's everywhere else as well, and you also are aware of that, the politicization, right? So I mean,
Mm,
the issue is you also have to, in some sense, in this case it would be to take politics out of context, right? I mean, so if because otherwise, if
Mm,
the people that are there and they have identity built around political connection, then it would be hard for them to let the guard down.
mhm,
And because I mean, in some sense, I mean, what you are talking about building trust is also about, hey, okay, I see we are also showing vulnerability and the other side is also showing vulnerability in terms of that. How do you take, because it's not in the interest of the politicians, it's not in the interest of the larger wave in some sense that is there, so how do you tackle that, or how do you deal with that aspect?
mm,
it's interesting you say that. I mean, the first thing I would say is that at the start of this project, um, we deliberatively, because Australia has a large percentage of people, particularly 10, 15 years ago, um, skeptical of the science of anthropogenic climate change, particularly in rural farming communities. And so at the start of the project, we deliberately did not speak about climate change, we spoke about climate risk.
mm,
And there were some of our farmers who were leading farmers, I mean, that's why they were farming, they were climate champions, who were, I think, deniers of the anthropogenic science. But I can assure you by the end of the project, they weren't. And that happened from talking to each other farmers as well as
mm,
the scientists, that they changed that. And we didn't measure that, we didn't emphasize that, but I could see that that happened. But the second thing I would say is that the reason that the program finished was because a number of the farmers became political,
mm.
and the people funding the project got very uneasy about that.
Oh, interesting.
And in fact, they started a group called Farmers for Climate Action, which is still active today.
Wow.
And some of our farmers were crucial in setting up that. Not they weren't just our farmers, but they were crucial in setting that up. And and so the people funding it from the government research and development corporations were very uneasy, and I'm
Oh, wow.
fairly sure that that's one reason they finished the program.
There was a
Well, it was
fear of,
too effective.
yeah.
Mm.
Well, yeah, it's interesting that it becomes, yeah, it's simultaneously the government is trying, there's this desire to get people to quote listen to the science, and yet there's this fear of being political, which seems completely at odds with each other. If you're being incredibly explicitly political and then simultaneously refusing the accountability of being political.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, that's
yeah.
really interesting. That the
Yes, it is.
also what you brought up to me, that it was very it was compelling, is this idea of needing to spend time with each other. That also, it seems like the farmers spending time with each other allowed for them to feel solidarity in their movement. And how at odds that is with how often it's like debate between climate change person and climate change denier, 1v1, winner takes all sort of like model of like thinking about things. Um, it takes a long time, and I see this sort of in a lot of your work. I see, maybe I'm projecting here, but I'd like you to talk about this. I see a sort of anti quick tips and tricks mentality to a lot of what you say, that you're sort of like against this, like there's not one quick solution here, stop trying to like do it in one thing. Could you speak to that?
Well, in fact, we do give a lot of quick tips and tricks
That's a
in
consultancy, like,
I did see
in our
that
new.
on your page, but I still feel this thread. Maybe I'm projecting here.
Yeah, no, I think if that comes through, that's great, because I'm sometimes worried that we do give too many quick tips and tricks. I mean, one thing that we also do is training, mostly of scientists, but also of science communicators. And yeah, I mean, we've recently done two lots of training with science communicators in Africa, Asian, Middle Eastern countries. And it's been largely online training with some face-to-face in Delhi at a conference for the International Agricultural Research Centres known as the SIGIA centres. And the purpose of the training was to teach them how to tell stories about gender responsive research in agriculture and climate. Yeah, that was really, really. I forget the point I was going to make now, but I was going to say, yeah, oh yeah, the
Tips and
quick
tricks.
tip things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so what that composed of was 8 modules, 2 hours each online, going through tips and tricks. But they also had to go and write a story, and the last group were at a conference and had to write a blog as well. They didn't had to, but we supported them to publish a story, not in their own organisation, but somewhere else, on gender responsive research, and to publish one online. But what made both lots of training really work wasn't so much the tips we gave in the online sessions, but there was a group of 3 of us in my team. We did one-on-one mentoring in between all of those sessions. And so we each had 5 people that we mentored over the course of 3 to 5 months. And it was that mentoring, which in the evaluation, they really valued. And that's much more than quick tips and tricks.
It's relationships.
So I think, yeah, it is. Absolutely. Absolutely.
How often did you meet in those 3 to 5 months? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
It was once a week over. So there was a gap in the middle where they went out on a field trip to actually interview women and researchers in the field who were doing something in agriculture. So yeah, the training happened sort of over 3 months, but there were 8 weeks, and there was sort of 4 or 5 weeks, one after the other, and then there was a gap of 2 or 3 weeks where they went and did a field trip. And then there was the final ones where they were drafting and crafting their stories and pitching them.
That's great. The reason I was asking was because, I mean, I know in Pakistan, where I do a lot of my work as well, over there's a lot of interest right now. I mean, science communication is booming. I mean, I think at one level. And they've been also doing similar types of things, sort of like, the workshops for science journalists and science communicators and things like that. And I just like this idea. And so I don't know how effective it is because, I mean, they invite me, and again, so I'm here, so I have a pretty relatively limited interaction, but this is something that's interesting, and so I will definitely mention to the folks that organize it to actually look into this as well. I mean, this is really interesting.
Yeah, well, we had a sort of celebratory online session last night, actually, which was their morning with our last cohort of trainees. So some months after they finished, but some are still getting their stories published. And yeah, they talked about what they got out of it, and they were all saying that they feel like they want to keep going in this space. One of the big things they learned was, well, what is a gender responsive solution? It's not just about women benefiting from the research. It's about research that's been specifically designed with women's needs in mind. So that was a big learning curve for them and for us, I should say. But yeah, it was wonderful. It was particularly really good with the last group to meet them face to face in Delhi over a week of training, and yeah, it just formed so much closer relationships, and yeah.
Yeah, it makes me. I think one of the frustrations I've had teaching storytelling and science communication through storytelling has been the fly in, fly out model, that I try to give the tools to be like, listen to each other, keep this going. And one of the organizations I've had a really good relationship with is this foundation that works with health justice activists. And what the model we've worked on is very much like, I'm going to leave. This is because I can't stay. So like, how do we build these connections between you guys so that this maintains? And they've been continuing to do meetups without me there. And I get the email updates, and
which is great.
I resist going because I want to go, but I'm also like, I'm not going to be there all the time to hold your hand. But I wonder how we can get more people to do that. I think my initial instinct is like, I think there's a lot of ego still around that might stop some people from being able to do it. That's at least my perspective. Maybe that's
I think
me.
resources too. I mean, but you need resources
Yeah.
too, right? I mean, I think
To maintain stuff,
to maintain that type of thing. I mean, I think that's work-wise, I mean, it's a pretty intensive thing, right? So I mean, so that also adds up to that.
Well, one of the things that we did was to develop a booklet based on our training, which is now publicly available on the CGIAR website. But the exciting thing is that a number of our participants have done their own training of their colleagues since that time, which has been wonderful. And there's also a growing community of practice, which CGIAR is nurturing in this space. So hopefully it will continue.
Salman and I have been, I think, going back and forth on this. This is how I've been framing it, is that science is this cycle of unknown and known. It's like you know something, and then what you know leads you to something that is unknown, and then you try to figure that out. And it feels very much like you're in that with science communication. You're building this iterative process where you're like, we're going to do something, and hopefully you will iterate on it. So
well, I always think, I mean, the exciting thing about being a science communicator, or you might have realized in one of my recent papers that I'm talking about changing that to being a knowledge communicator. But one of the exciting things is that I'm always learning everything. I'm learning new things. Every day I learn new things. And so it's a mutual learning process and knowledge development process. And there are always going to be unknowns. That's the process of science. It's the process of knowledge, that there's unknowns, and that's the exciting exploration frontier that we always have day by day.
Well, this poses the question that Salman and I were just talking about. I'm very curious as to your answer to this. Are you more excited by the discovery of an unknown, or the like solution, like finding the solution to something?
I actually think it's neither of those.
Oh, you're not joining either of our sides. This is our big debate.
I actually think what excites me the most, which actually covers both of those things, is people feeling like they have the knowledge, the power to change their own lives, their own environments, and them feeling like there's been something positive from their interaction with science, with each other, with different forms of knowledge. To me, that's the exciting thing.
Is the empowerment?
Empowerment. That's the word that
I can't empower anyone, but I can help provide them with the opportunities to empower themselves. And to me, that's exciting. I haven't talked about the big project I'm working on at the moment in Saudi Arabia, which involves engaging communities, Bedouin communities, in fairly remote areas in the northwest of Saudi Arabia, in nature conservation and in 6 new nature reserves. And we have 30 nature champions involved in that. And we're going out and we're providing them with opportunities to learn new knowledge that they can share with their communities. And so hearing their stories of what they've learned and how they've shared that with their communities and what they're doing because of that, to me, is exciting.
So it's the
that's really amazing, and that's where the local context become really crucial to these conversations. And also Saudi Arabia is changing really fast. I mean, I think this is an important time to bring this element in before urbanization or whatever sort of like, takes place. How has the reaction been sort of like, to this kind of conservation efforts?
Well, I think the communities, what we started off with was going out to 14 different villages and talking to the sheikh and some of the men, and where possible, some of the women, and listening to them and what they think and what they want to know, and that whole thing of listening. And I think it may be the first time that anyone's ever listened, and then going back and showing that we've listened. And I think that's been really important. Yeah, it's a really good opportunity to achieve the goals of the local government there, which is to get people engaged in nature, to get them looking after nature, as well as having people's voices heard. And we see very much these nature champions as being conduits between their local community and the government, the government's Department of Nature and Natural Heritage.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, I think that may be a good place to close our conversation. Any last thoughts, Nisse or Jenni, about that?
I'm thinking this. I think what you've inspired in me, maybe you've empowered in me a thing I think I ruminate on all the time, which is when I teach storytelling workshops, I teach story listening workshops. That is what I frame them as. And one thing I've struggled with for so long is that fly
I
in,
like
fly
that.
out.
I might steal that.
Take
Nisse.
it, please do. I got a lot of
Very
language about
different.
it.
I
I'll
like
send
it.
to you. You can take it. I think what I've struggled with is that I feel oftentimes like I'm giving tools and I'm like showing people how to listen. And then I'm leaving and I'm like, I don't know. Are they going to listen to each other? Are they going to listen to the right people? So often if I'm in like a very sciencey space, which I've started to resist a lot lately, I'm like, who are you going to listen to? Are you just going to listen to each other? Are you just going to listen to a bunch of postdocs who all have the exact same experience of life coming into this? And what you've sort of empowered in me is that like, it's not going to happen in a second. It's time is this big variable that I'm not paying attention to. Relationality needs time, needs,
Totally.
I mean, what you said about the farmers getting on the land, I think one of the things I've been very focused on is being on land together and experiencing the same things. But it takes time being on the land together. I plant a lot of things. I plant that seed and I panic about how it's not going to grow because I'm still a human in my time scale. But it takes time till that seed grows. It's really fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Yes, indeed. It is time. It takes time, which can be expensive, but it's certainly worth the investment. And the outcomes to me are much higher and a greater quality than something that is easier, cheaper, and more fleeting.
Deeper engagement and time. I think it's like deep time. So like deep engagement is something like that. Well, Jenni, thank you so much for your time, and it was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed our conversation.